It's winter. You turn up the heat, pull on a thick jacket, huddle around your heated blanket. When the cold gets uncomfortable, you drink hot chocolate and crank up the thermostat. Your lights stay on. Your water stays hot. Now forget all of that. Picture a village in northern Europe sometime in the 1300s. The ground is frozen solid. The river has stopped moving. A trip outside means numb fingers and aching feet within minutes. Wet clothes don't dry. They freeze. And on the days the sun appears at all, it disappears before the afternoon is over, leaving up to 16 hours of darkness. This isn't the kind of season you endure for a weekend until the weather improves. This is the kind of season that decided whether your family saw spring. And the cold was only one of the problems. Medieval winter also brought starvation when the food ran out, disease that spread fast in crowded spaces, and an isolation that could cut an entire family off from any help at all. Survive one and another was already waiting. So how did people with none of our technology survive all of it? They couldn't fight winter head-on, so instead, they built armor against it, layer by layer, method by method. And the first piece of that armor was heat. Not generating more of it, they didn't have that option, but holding on to what they already had. In many parts of Northern Europe, animals weren't kept in a separate barn. They lived on the ground floor of the same building the family lived in. Pigs, cattle, sheep, all indoors, all winter. Body heat rises, so the warmth coming off those animals drifted upward into the living space above. It was loud, it smelled, and medieval people had simply decided that freezing to death was worse than living above a pig. So up they stayed. But it solved two problems at once. The animals kept the people warmer, and being kept inside kept the animals from freezing to death overnight. A farmer who lost his ox in January had no way to plow in March. Keeping animals indoors wasn't just about comfort, it was making sure they didn't lose the tools that kept the whole household alive. The second piece was clothing. And this is where most people picture a medieval peasant wrapped in one rough wool cloak and call it done. But medieval winter clothing wasn't a single garment. It was armor. And like armor, every layer had a specific job. The underlayer, usually linen, sat against the skin and pulled moisture away from the body. Over that came wool, sometimes 2 or 3 layers of it. Wool is unusual because it holds warmth even when wet. Lose your outer layer in the rain, and the layers underneath are still working. Over everything came a heavy outer cloak, often lined with fur or fleece, designed to stop wind at the surface. Feet were wrapped in wool strips before boots went on. Hands went into thick mittens rather than gloves, because mittens keep the fingers pressed together, sharing heat between them. Medieval people had invented the concept of layering centuries before anyone thought to put it on a ski resort brochure. Strip any one of these layers and something got through. The system only worked whole. Staying warm was only half the battle. A family could survive the cold and still starve before spring arrived. So medieval people became serious about making food last. And it started before winter even came. By the time the first snow arrived, medieval people weren't producing food anymore. Whatever would keep them alive until spring was already sitting in a granary, a root cellar, or a hayloft. Which meant summer wasn't just summer, it was the deadline. No grain meant no bread. No hay meant no animals. No animals meant no plowing come spring. One empty store had a way of becoming an empty field, so they preserved food any way they could. Meat was salted, fish was smoked, or dried. Vegetables went into root cellars dug deep enough that the earth's own temperature kept them from freezing. Grains like rye, barley, and oats were stored and portioned out slowly, because the same grain feeding the family also had to be saved as seed for spring planting. Some of it was fermented. Cabbage became sauerkraut. Dairy became cheese because medieval people had discovered that the right kind of bacteria could keep food alive far longer than leaving it to chance. None of these methods were perfect. Salt ran out. Smoking didn't work on everything. Root cellars failed in an unusually deep freeze. The danger came not when one thing went wrong, but when two did at once. But the cold and hunger weren't even always the deadliest part of winter. Diseases were. Here's what most people get wrong about disease in medieval winter. They picture total helplessness, people getting sick, dying, and having no idea why. But that's not what the records show. Medieval winters pushed families indoors for months. Sadly, the spaces were crowded, smoky, and poorly ventilated. Worse still, many people were already weakened by the cold and by months of limited food. It was, to put it plainly, a perfect environment for everything to go wrong at once. Pneumonia moved through great halls where dozens slept pressed together. Typhus spread through the body lice that thrived in clothing worn for months without washing. Respiratory infections that antibiotics would clear up in a week today became death sentences then. Medieval communities had no germ theory, no microscopes, no understanding of bacteria or viruses. But they had something centuries of hard winters had built into them: pattern recognition. They noticed that sickness spread from person to person and that crowded spaces helped it spread even faster. So they did something we'd recognize immediately. They separated the sick from the healthy, isolated households, kept the ill away from shared food and water. Many communities learned to isolate the sick. Quarantine in practice without ever having the word for it. Not because they understood the mechanism, but because they'd watched enough winters to know what happened when they didn't act. The knowledge wasn't scientific, but the instinct was correct. And here's the second thing most people get wrong. They assume medieval people survived because they were simply tougher than us, harder bodies, higher pain tolerance, more accustomed to suffering. But toughness alone didn't keep anyone alive. The communities that made it through the worst winters weren't built around the strongest individuals. They were built around the most functional systems. In many communities, grain stores were managed collectively and distributed based on need. Fuel was gathered and shared. People who couldn't contribute labor, the elderly, the sick, the very young, were kept alive by what the community had stored together. The ones who died weren't always the physically weakest. They were often the most isolated. A single family cut off from the village network. A farm too far from a trade route. A community that had already lost too many members to hold itself together. Isolation was the real killer. Not cold, not even disease. Isolation. Winter in medieval times was never an individual problem. It was always a collective one. You stayed close. You layered up. You shared what you had. Most winters weren't survived because of one brilliant invention or one heroic act. People survived because hundreds of small decisions worked exactly as they were supposed to. The food lasted, the heat held, the sick were cared for. The community stayed connected. And when those pieces came together, they survived winters that, by any modern standard, should have been unsurvivable. So how did medieval people survive the world's deadliest winters? Not by enduring, but by building. They built systems that held the cold, the hunger, and the disease back long enough for spring to arrive. Winter was never just a season to them. It was a test of everything they had built, and everyone they were willing to protect. The ones who survived weren't protected by a single thing. They were protected by everything working together.